Brandow. Hello, everyone who is joining.
Let's do it. It's go time.
So today we have a very exciting episode on the topic of acing that conference talk, which is the follow-up episode to the previous one on the topic of how to ace that call for papers submission. And we have hosts and we're all wearing the same hats for this show today. So I'm joined by Kris and Johnny. How are you guys doing?
I'm doing well. It's another great day to be recording a podcast.
Yeah, we were just talking before the beginning of this as we were doing our and how was it like to record a podcast in 2009, 13 years ago, and I guess it is a better day now to do this than 13 years ago.
Yeah, no clapping, no. We still have to do some secondary recordings, but I'm hoping one day we won't have to do that either. But yeah, it's a much improved experience.
It does feel weird to say.
So, what do you think of the
2009.
Eurovision winner? The most important question. Silence in the room. It's my favorite question to ask American people. What do you think of the Eurovision? What is the Eurovision? Have you seen the movie about the Eurovision? 2020 during COVID, no Eurovision, so then the movie came out in a perfect timing. Have you seen that?
You explained it you explained it I think one or two episodes ago, and then I was like, oh, that's interesting. That's an interesting concept. And then I was like, do I really want to go seek that out and watch it or experience it? And I was like, eh.
That's
a fun movie. You saw from this year?
Yeah, I saw clips from this year's Eurovision. I've seen clips from previous year's Eurovisions as well, and I'm like, I think that's enough for me. I imagine Europeans are much more into it, but
Israel and Australia, the new European, non-European Eurovision members.
Australia's in it.
It's a rather recent thing, and yes.
I can sort of get like Israel. It's like, okay, well, you're close enough.
It's a stretch.
But Australia is like, that's a whole different continent. Like,
so it's just a name. It's just that basically it's the spirit of the event, not necessarily what part of the world you're in. Yes, no.
What's the term for that? UK, the way that they see the world. There's a name for that from that is
Eurocentric
like
or
the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth.
The Commonwealth.
Australia is part of the Commonwealth, and UK is actually no longer in the European Union, but it's still somewhat Europe. So
right.
Makes sense to bring Australia on board.
I mean, it's still in. Oh, I see. Because Australia is part of the Commonwealth, it's like, oh, okay. By that measure, you could also have Canada be.
That's my answer. I don't know if this is the reason, but I know that this is a recent thing. They had a fun song. It was very 80s this year. Well, I recommend to everybody to listen to the Finland song. It was really cool. Now that we have the conferences, they're as exciting as performing in the Eurovision, but you actually have probably higher chances because in the Eurovision, each country only sends one person 1 year, and in a conference, you can have many people from the same country presenting the different talks. So it's also different types of presentation when you present a song versus when you talk.
I don't know. I think I've seen people saying their presentations. At least part of the presentation. Yeah, actually, it was at DevOps Days in Austin a couple weeks ago, and the last speaker of the talk I think he rapped the first half of his talk, or the first third of his talk. I'm not sure if he meant to do that. Maybe it might have been just nervous energy, but it did sound like he did rehearse it a little bit, but he was very nervous doing it. I was like, it's cool, dude. No judgment. Just do your thing. you know.
Instead of remembering the first few words of your talk, you just remember third.
That is a nice hidden talent.
Yeah.
I know, right?
Like, I accidentally rap sometimes when I'm giving presentations. Like, oh, okay.
Yeah, hey, anything to make it stand out, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I remind myself at presentations to slow down. For a while, when I was teaching myself or practicing kind of the skill speaking slower, which is very hard because I'm listening to podcasts usually on 2x the speed, and I'm used to this very speed, and then trying to slower than what I'm used to. What helped me was actually in the speaker notes write timestamps. At this slide, you should be 5 minutes in. At this slide, it should be 10 minutes in. It means I see the 5 minutes and it's only been 2 minutes, then I know I spoke too fast, or the other way around, I spoke too much about a topic. So this get in sync.
Yeah, I've always found that when I'm giving a talk, no matter how many times I practice it, I will always take up less time when I'm actually on stage. So it'll be like, oh, you've taken this 45 minutes you're practicing, and you're going 55 minutes or an hour, and then I get on stage and it's like 40 minutes. Oh, okay. I guess I'll go faster when I'm actually up on stage doing it. And I've heard that like from a number of people that like it's a common thing that happens where no matter how much you practice, you still wind up going usually quicker. Sometimes a few people I've run into it said like it takes them longer than their practice rounds. But I haven't really ever heard anybody say, I get it in exactly the amount of time that I practiced it in. Is that y'all's experience as well? Or do I just have a very odd sample size?
No, I think that tends to happen. That's happened to me in the past. I kept, when you were saying that, I kept trying to think of when was the last time I gave like a talk, like a rehearsed talk. And I don't know, it's got to be like years. Like I've done, like I do speak, but it's more like, training and teaching and everything. And it is less, to me, that's way less rehearsal. Like I usually go in with some material and some bullet points of what I want to touch on, but much of it is sort of a it's like stream of consciousness kind of thing. Well, I don't know, that sounds kind of bad, but it's prepared material, but it's not like I'm reading off of a teleprompter or spitting back out what I memorized. It's much more natural. Plus I usually want feedback from the audience, like people are asking questions, and I'm sort of answering in real time. Like to me, I think one of the reasons, like I think I got so intimidated by speaking that I was like, okay, well, how do I turn this into something that I'm comfortable with? And I found, basically that if I was to teach something, it's the audience is way more forgiving of my stutters and ums and ahs and things like that, right? And I'm much more forgiving of myself, right, for not sort of coming off like smooth, right? Like every word is just where it needs to be, and no repetitions, no ums and things. Like I'm much more forgiving of myself if I'm teaching. That way I can engage the audience. I can sort of provide examples on the fly, that kind of thing. Like oddly enough, some people find that terrifying, right? To go in unprepared. But to me, that's like way more my comfort zone than to try and memorize. Because the moment if I memorize something and I go up there, I'm like, crap, don't forget. What? How do I start this sentence again? What's this next part again? Like, don't forget. Like, and I end up forgetting something, and I'm like, crap. Do I now start over? Like, and like a split second, like all of this sort of panic is going through my head. I'm like, wow. It's just overwhelming. Like I'm way much more comfortable doing sort of the ad lib thing, with a plan, of course. But I don't know. That's just me.
I think that's probably a good tip for new speakers is figure out the technique that works for you, as far as like how much do you need in speaker's notes? How particular do you want to be in the actual talk? Like I know Dave Cheney would usually get up on stage and literally read through his talk, and that's how he would do it. And there's other people. Ooh, sorry.
We'll catch it in post.
Yeah. Let me see. Where was I in that? Okay.
Dave Cheney.
Yeah, Dave Cheney. So there are other people who are a bit like you, Johnny, and I think I fall into that camp as well, where it's like I tend to be very nimble on my speaker's notes, and I rarely actually follow them. They're more like guideposts. That's like you're in the right direction, you're moving in the right direction of the talk, and I find that if I do need to cut any content because I'm running too long, that it makes it a bit easier to do that than if I'm trying to go through like a very like well rehearsed, these are the actual words that I want to say, speech like format. So I think for our listeners who might be listening to this being like, oh, how do I do this? It's figure out which kind of camp you fall into, or where along that spectrum you fall into, and just know that it's fine wherever you are. But you might need to do a little bit of different planning during your talk as a result. But you should
During
plan
the Corona times, I found that most of my talks obviously were online. And there I noticed that I prefer something that is a lot more like a script versus a stage in front of people where I need those kind of bullet points just to remember I mentioned everything that is important about a specific slide. And maybe for me it's back, like, even if it's a conference, virtual conference, and not just a Zoom call with a bunch of pictures, but actually you see people's camera on form, it's just still not the same. So maybe there it was more like narrating something.
Or I'm not sure if you've ever experienced giving a talk effectively to those online platforms, kind of like what we're using now, but basically where most of the time there is no it's not like on Zoom where you have like squares and rectangles where people just like you can get that visual sort of feedback from people's faces. Like I remember giving a talk. I was at a QCon maybe like a couple years ago during the pandemic, and basically I was speaking, I couldn't see anybody, right? So whatever jokes that I did, or like I had to kind of like laugh at my own jokes and imagine that the audience was like laughing with me. It's the weirdest, most surreal thing, right? Like, or if I'm teaching, on like on O'Reilly or Lincoln or whatever it is, like there is no, I'm not sure why they do that, but those platforms, they don't show you other people, right? That you don't get visual feedback if your talk or whatever material you're trying to cover. You can't, and that's such an important part of the whole speaking process, right? And I know for some, depending on sort of your experience with speaking, you get on stage and you're looking at a sea of faces looking back at you. I know for some people that's very frightening, but I thrive on that, right? And I think to your point, you have to kind of find that sweet spot. Well, if you're gonna do any sort of speaking, right, unless you're like doing one of those platforms where you don't get any visual feedback, you don't get to see people. If you're gonna go on stage anywhere, or if you're gonna speak at any event, you kind of have to develop some form of expertise, or not expertise, but some form of familiarity with the fact that you got to have people looking back at you. Like, do it with your family, or do it with extended family, friends, whatever it is. Heck, go to your local meetup. Perfect place for that, right? You try out your talk at your local meetup. It's a much smaller audience, much more forgiving, right? And they, encourage feedback from them. Like, get comfortable with that, right? Don't let showing up at a conference on stage be the very first time you get like eyeballs staring back at you, because that is frightening as all hell. The first time you do it, oh my goodness, it is very frightening indeed. But you just have to it's like everything else, it's a learned skill. You just have to get used to it, right? You get comfortable with it, and then sort of develop that familiarity with it.
Yeah, I think that people are generally unaware of what their facial expression is doing when they're intently paying attention to something. So as a speaker on stage, as I think one of the things that you learn early is that, like, don't look too much into how people are like expressing, because it might just be that they're looking that way because they're just very focused on your talk. Like, I remember the first few times I was up on stage and I was just like, okay, people are just like, I don't know if people are actually interested.
Looking.
Yeah, But then there's like kind of those things where it's like, oh, you hit like the next button and there's a slide that comes up and everybody like pulls out their phone and starts taking pictures. Okay, people are engaged. I also think it helps if you can find like that one person who's just like into your talk and giving you good feedback and just look at them for a good chunk of your talk. Like I've had that before too, and it's just been great. It's just like, okay, you're that one person that I'm
That's
just
a really
gonna
good tip. Yeah.
just gonna look to, and it's gonna be like a conversation between the two of us with just a whole bunch of people around, and that also can really help calm the nerves.
Yeah,
Ideally, you would
especially
know
when you
this
see them
person
nod.
because it would be kind of awkward to just find some stranger who happens to be smiling. Nah, they're uncomfortable. You're uncomfortable. You're just staring at them the whole time. It's like, why are you looking at me, man? Yeah.
Yeah. It is a little bit harder to, depending on how the stage is set up, to see that the speaker's looking directly at you. But yeah, don't stare at one person the entire time. That's also unless they're like your friend and you've had a conversation beforehand. And you're like, okay, if I get nervous, I'm just gonna look at you, and it's just gonna be like we're hanging out at a restaurant having a chat.
Like I find it like personally, I find it difficult to lock eyes with anybody. Like when I'm looking at the audience, first of all, like if I'm lucky enough to be able to sort of see out in the audience, because sometimes if you're on stage, depending on where you are, the lights might be just hitting your eyes just in the right way that you can't see anything, or you just see shapes and figures out in front of you. But like I don't try to seek eye contact per se. I might look through people, but that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm looking through, like I'm not locking eyes and focusing on anybody. I'm sort of glancing, right, and saying, okay, are they glancing back, right? But I'm not trying to basically lock eyes with anybody, because to me that's intimidating. That's kind of okay. What if whoever I lock eyes with and maybe they had a bad day and they're just angry looking? Then I would be like, oh crap. Right. But yeah, it could be their focus face, like I look angry and I'm focused, It's like, okay. Like what if I, happen to look at the wrong person or something, right? But yeah, but those regardless of what your style ends up being, that's the thing though. You have to discover your style, right? Like the first time, the first 2, 3, 4, 5, heck, the first dozen times you do it, it might take that long for you to find your style, to find your sweet spot, what works for you, what doesn't, what lessens the, dulls the edge a little bit, what are you comfortable doing if you know your material, well enough that you can ad lib a little bit. Like you have to find that sweet spot for you, and I think for people it's different, right? Like we've all attended, many conferences at this point. We can tell who's comfortable on stage, right? We can tell who has rehearsed. We can tell who's going off of bullet points and just allowing sort of a natural sort of cadence to their talks. We can tell who is super nervous and just wants to read their slides. And we can actually tell who is very prepared and still uses their slides and reads off their slides, right? So all these sort of slight nuances and things, you can tell all that stuff, right? If you attend enough conferences or if you give enough talks. But these things are, I think, part of developing your own style and understanding sort of where your comfort zone is attending talks, is giving talks at your local meetup. It is taking a leap of faith and submitting that conference proposal, and if you get accepted, going on stage and doing it for the first time. There's a first for everything, right? But you're not gonna find that sweet spot. You're not gonna find your comfort zone until you actually do it.
About that bullet points, I think it is a good tip that I received early on is that the crowd doesn't know what you want to say. So even if you said something too early and then you see it in the next slide, the best thing you can do is ignore. The less good thing you can do is say, oh, I wanted to say, oh, or I mentioned, or I'm kind of like saying, but this is deviating from the structure that I had. Nobody knows your structure.
Nobody
It's
knows.
fine. Just move on.
Yeah.
So this was also something that I was practicing kind of sometimes because I went so on a top, like I enjoyed talking about something that I went outside of the structure and telling myself like, just look at this, let this thought be, don't speak it out, take this moment of silence, move on, is an acquired skill. And also just the silence on stage. Sometimes, at least about myself, because I tend to speak fast at times, and I had to also practice including 1 or 2 stops. And a good way of doing that is telling a joke and waiting for the crowd to laugh. And it always feels like 27 minutes from the moment you say until it reaches the crowd and the laugh reaches you back. But this is actually, I try always to do a joke early enough to get this time delay and remind myself that this is the pace. So kind of if I show a slide for 3 seconds and move on, it means most people will not even understand it.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
setting the pace with a little bit of a stop, a little bit of a joke, a little bit of a understanding kind of the velocity of the group is important as well.
Yeah, so excuse me. Someone gave me some advice that's a lot like that in the past, where I gave a practice talk and they said, "Oh, you're saying and ah a lot. Think about those as like little breaks for the audience. So instead of saying or ah, just take it as like it's okay to just have a little silence there and give people a little bit of time to process." And I think that helps with both, like, you know, then you don't wind up saying and ah a lot, but you also give your audience like a little bit more breathing room to kind of really understand what it is you have said.
It's like when you prepare a workshop, you obviously cover 75% and then you're happy. And then you say like the remaining 25% is for those who are curious, here's later for you. Same with talks, like you can always squeeze more, but actually filtering what's important is the harder thing to do, but it's the better way of sending across that knowledge.
I can't stress this enough, honestly. It's oftentimes when you know, for in the case of GopherCon, you know, when we're asked as the chairs, when we're asked to sort of mentor people who are first time speakers and things of that nature, like I end up always basically saying like, look, I know you've got a lot of material here. There's an interesting thing that happens for first time speakers. One, they're frightened, right? At some level, right, that they're about to step on stage, especially at an event as big as GopherCon, and basically say, like, well, all these people, it's going to be recorded, it's going to be on YouTube afterwards, like all these sort of outside things, even before they sort of look at the content, like they have to produce and the slides they have to create and whatnot. And then from then on, it's just working backwards, saying, well, how do I impress these people? How do I make this a good talk? How do I not embarrass myself? Like all these things, it's like everything having to do with anything except the content they need to put together. It's like all these fears. And it's like, okay, well, let's take a step back. Rather than working backwards from, oh my God, this is very frightening, right? How about we work bottom up, you know, in terms of the content you need to cover? And then what they start doing is like, okay, how much can I cover? Then I'm like, okay, why do you want to cover so much, right? Then like, well, I don't know. Like, I'm like, well, is it because that you are trying to prove that you belong up here, right? Are you trying to impress? Are you trying to show your technical acumen, or like why is it that you need to? What are you trying to prove, basically, right? Because you can go on stage and spout out everything you know about a particular topic, and then people walk out thinking, okay, that was just way too much. I don't remember any of it. Or you can say, let me pick 3 things. I usually tell people, like, look, listen, rule of 3s always helps across the board. Whatever you're doing, rule of 3. Oh, that's a good starting point. Pick 3 things, right? 3 important things, three fascinating things you think you want to talk about for any given topic. And then trust me, you know, in 30 minutes or 45 minutes, right? Those 3 things are your only mission. Elaborate on them just enough, right? Have a beginning, middle, and end, right? And don't try to teach everybody about everything there is to know about a given topic. Just pick the 3 interesting ones, right? And then give yourself enough time, right? Maybe add some humor in there if that's your thing. Maybe, you know, work in some pauses, right? Or rather than ums, right? You know, give yourself, you know, give the audience a bit of time to catch up on what you're trying to teach, right? Like people like really sort of overestimate how much people retain from a talk, right? Like it's a lesson I had to learn even in teaching, because when you're teaching, like there's so much material that you're trying to cover. At this point, it's like, okay, that's just way too much to cover in this, right? And like Natalie says, if you want to know more, here are resources and here are places and here's a link, a document, wiki, whatever it is, right? You can always point people to other places where they can go further their knowledge. But your job is really you're kind of like the you're introducing, a lot of times you're introducing people to a new idea or to a technology or to a framework or to a link, whatever it is, right? You introducing. Your job is to, unless you go unless you're speaking to a group of experts on a very particular subject where you can be certain that all of these people have all the background and context necessary, and you're just here to talk about something very specific and you need to dive in great depth and detail, there's a time for that, right? But at a again, this is Go time, but at a Go conference, for example, you can't teach everything there is to know about any one thing, about Go in 30 minutes or 45 minutes. Learn to, provide resources and things, and just focus on 3 important things that you want to relay, right? Tell stories along the way.
Yeah, I think that kind of relates to something it's about writing, but I was watching this one YouTube video. I probably brought it up before, but it's answer in progress video where the premise of the video is...
show notes.
Yeah, we can add that in the show notes. The premise of the video is basically this question of like, why are people so bad at writing? And the kind of, spoiler conclusion it kind of gets to is, for a lot of us, we spend all of our time in school learning how to write to demonstrate knowledge instead of learning how to write to teach others or to communicate with other people. And I think conference talks are a lot like that. I think people tend to go and think that they need to demonstrate knowledge to an audience of people, but the mode you should be operating in is this, like, I want to teach these people something. And, when you're trying to demonstrate knowledge, you're trying to like really pack in as much as you can to be like, look, I understand this. But your audience in that case are people that already know the thing that you know, and you're just showing them that you know the thing. That's not pretty much any conference talk. People that already know the thing are probably not going to go to your talk. So the bulk of your audience are going to be people that don't know and probably don't have a lot of context for what you want to talk about. So whatever it is you want to put in your talk, probably like cut it down, to take a rule of 3s, Johnny, by a third. Like, do a third less of, like, a third of what you were going to do originally. And that will probably be roughly the right amount of stuff. In a piece or series of pieces I wrote about CFP a couple years ago, I gave this recommendation of, and I think I got this from Dave Cheney, of for like a 20-minute talk, have like one main thing you're trying to teach people. And for a 45-minute talk, you can have like 2 or 3, but like don't go above that. So once again, your rule of 3 there, Johnny, of really keep to those 3 solid things and like demarcate them in your talk. Because any more, and people are just not going to be able to remember what it is you said, because it's just like, once again, like an assault of information, no matter how much you try and strip it down.
Yep. Yep.
It's also a good point about the context, having in mind that most people know less than you think. It's like that XKCD comic that say, oh, of course, everybody knows this about the 352 processor and so on. And then it's like, the what?
No, exactly. One of the things you mentioned, Kris, is that or rather, one of the things that came up while you were elaborating is sometimes you have to sort of know how to deal with people who do show up to your talk knowing what you're going to be talking about, but they themselves want to demonstrate knowledge to their audience and their peers. So you've probably come across them. Heck, you probably had to deal with them when you give a talk. The people that will raise their hand and make a statement rather than ask a question, right? You kind of have to learn how to deal with those, especially if you're a new speaker, because these people can sort of completely throw you off your game, right? They can stand up and say, well, my experience is that thingamabob, does, thingamajiggy instead of whatever you just said, that's not how it works. I don't think that's the right way to do it, right? They will go on, they'll literally take up like 2 minutes, 3 minutes to just go through their whatever it is they want to do, and then at the end you're like, okay, thanks for that, right? Like you have to anticipate that there are going to be those people in the audience who are there not really to learn from you, but to really show others that they know something, right? And my advice to you, if you're a new speaker, heck, even if you're an experienced speaker who hasn't had to deal with this yet, is basically say, oh, okay, thank you. I'm sure some of this I didn't know, and some of this many folks in the audience didn't know. Thanks for that. Right, and then you just give them the acknowledgement that they seek, and then you move on with your life.
Yeah. I think that's like I remember when I was talking to the organizers of GopherCon, one of the things they mentioned is just like, yeah, we don't do questions because questions are always just disastrous. And I think for that kind of reason, it's just like, oh, you spent all this time preparing this material, and now someone just asks you something random, perhaps related to the material. Like, are you even if you do kind of good with answering that, it usually still doesn't wind up being that good for the audience overall. I vastly prefer the like, oh, if you have questions, like, I'll be over there, come talk to me. Like, don't, as you say, Johnny, like, don't throw random stuff at me when I'm up on stage in front of like hundreds of people. Yeah,
and
if
all
you
your
are
brain
like
resources into doing this.
Yeah, and if you are a first-time speaker and you're nervous, I would say like ask the conference if you have to take questions, or even request not taking questions. So I also think like questions can eat into your talk time, and I think that talk time would be better spent on your actual content, getting people to understand it, than maybe answering some random questions. And also kind of feels a little bad if you're like, does anybody have any questions? Like, no one has any questions. You're like, oh. So either I did really good or really bad.
But also no questions after the... I you had a break and then somebody meets you at the conference area, that's great. But at the end of the talk, after everybody clapped and still in the room, and then there's a cue to the microphone, that also something I would not opt in for anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, that's why I'm like, yeah, if you want to talk to me when I'm off stage, great. That sounds fine. Let's have a conversation.
I have reset.
Yeah.
If you end your talk a little bit early and you ask the audience if they have any questions and you get crickets, it's usually a good time if you have a little bit of extra, maybe like a joke related to whatever it is you just covered or something, right? That leaves on a positive note. Because I hate when I don't hate, but I think it could be better if when speakers walk off the stage, it left like a memorable, sort of lasting, sort of feel good impression kind of thing when you're walking off the stage, right? That I think that makes you more memorable than to just end on a very dense technical note, asking if questions. Not that people didn't find what you were saying interesting, but if you just laid, like a ton of, dense information on people, they're probably still processing whatever you just said. So if they don't have questions for you right away, it's because a lot of times they're trying to articulate like what it is that they're thinking, right? Because the stuff you just covered might have just been packed with just stuff. So I know a lot of times, like, I've sat in the audience and kept thinking, okay, she just covered a lot of in-depth material on the Go memory model or something. I have so many questions, but I'm like, okay, I know she's about to walk off the stage. I can't raise my hand and ask for, a question that would probably, take her 2 or 3 minutes just to answer. I'm thinking, okay, maybe I don't want to monopolize, the Q&A. Maybe like there's all these things going to people's heads, right? It's not that they don't, have questions per se, or that they didn't find your talk interesting. Sometimes it's just that they just need time, right? And again, to your point, say, hey, I'll be, around, I'll be on the side, I'll be whatever it is, right? After this, if you want to talk, come talk to me, like find me after, and we can dive into it a little bit. You'll find that way. You have to invite people though, because a lot of times people walk off stage, and you'll be surprised. Like even if you're a new speaker, people have sort of this intimidation factor in talking to people that are sort of perceived to be sort of at a different place from them, more advanced place from them, like technically. Like even if you're a new speaker, people will be like, oh, you're not considered an expert on whatever it is, right? Like I'm going to have some fear and trepidation about going and talk to you about something, right? Even worse, if you are a long-time speaker or you are well-known within the community, people are going to be very fearful of going up to you and walk up to you and sort of ask questions and have an intelligent conversation and ask questions, because they fear looking stupid in front of you, right? So like you have to go that extra mile and say, hey, please come talk to me after. I like to talk about this stuff. I'd love to hear your experience of it. Invite them, right, to come talk to you, because without that, you'll have missed some opportunities to connect with people.
Yeah, there's
Yeah,
always
and
that
it's important
fear.
to remember.
Oh yeah, there's always that fear of like the oh, you're someone special. Like I feel like in tech communities we tend to see some people as like deities, and we're like, oh no, I must not
Mm.
approach them. I think to some degree, like even us on this podcast right now are like deities. I remember at last GopherCon, I wasn't even speaking. I was just like an attendee. I was just there, and I walked up to a table where you were, Johnny. I sat down. I talked, and someone was like, "Oh hey, you're on Go Time too. I recognized your voice." And I was like, "Oh, okay." And it was one of those like, "Oh, okay." Like I'm in a slightly different position than a lot of other people. I think that's a good thing to keep in mind when you're a speaker as well, because it's just kind of like, yeah, people will see you a little bit differently than they might have seen you before. So just be like conscious of that. It's kind of one of those like they're afraid of you as much as you're afraid of them situations.
Everybody will know if this is one of your first talks and you're nervous about this. Like the fact that I look at the agenda and I recognize some names and I don't does not give me information. Is this the first time somebody's giving a talk? Or are they a seasoned speaker and we just cross paths now? So you're as a first time speaker, you know you're a first time speaker. Not everybody knows that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Something that is a mildly unpopular opinion, maybe not. How much time do you take to introduce yourself, or do you do this at all? Is this a slide? Is this half of your talk? How much do you introduce yourself in a presentation?
Half of the talk.
At a conference talk, not at a workshop.
Yeah, like 10 minutes in. Well, in my very first job from 20 years ago.
And that's me. It's been nice knowing you all.
I think in the conference talks I've given, like over time, I started to shrink the amount of introduction I had. I was just like, hi, I'm Kris. Here's where you can find me on the internet. And then like I'd try and move as quickly into like this is why I have like authority to talk about this, which I think is still kind of the introduction, but is more like laying the foundation for like why should you believe anything I have to say. And I think spending a little bit more time on that is important. So I think like less time talking about like, you know, oh, like I used to say a lot like, oh, I'm a baker and I do all this baking stuff, but it's like, okay, well, that's not really relevant to the talk. You can like mention it, but don't like spend a minute or two on that. So I think it's like, I tend to prefer shorter introductions because I want to get to the content. But yeah, that's where I fall for both like giving talks and for when I watch talks. Like I don't want to hear about your whole life for 10 minutes on stage. This isn't a biography about you. You're supposed to be like telling me something.
But it is important for you that the speaker introduces themselves and that they also add a part of why you should pick.
Yeah. I think like I want to know like who you are. Like I don't need an in-depth, but it's just like, okay, well, like, you know, because like I might want to go look up like other talks that you have or go look at your socials or whatever. So providing that to the audience is, I think, good. But I think especially like building credibility. I don't even know if it's credibility, but just like saying why you're talking about what you're talking about, like why you have a, you know, I guess authority to speak on this topic, I think is important because that also, I think, helps shift the audience's mindset into like, in some ways being able to challenge what you're saying, kind of process it more for themselves. Like, I think if you just kind of go off of like, oh, I have like this implicit authority and you should just straight up believe me, I think that can make it a little bit more difficult for audiences to absorb what you're saying. Like the same is true of like writing. Like if you have like an article or a book or whatever, like the question in the audience's mind should always be, why should I believe you? Like you need to build up your credibility with me about, you know, why you're giving this talk and why should I, you know, absorb it.
There's I think the latter, like the whole building of credibility thing, I think if you don't contextualize that, if you don't use a very specific kind of lens for it, I think it might be detrimental to new speakers, people who don't have experience in whatever it is they're about to talk about, right? So to me, I look for two signals, right? One, the establishing of credibility, if this is sort of your bread and butter, right? If somebody comes on stage and starts saying, "Hey, um, I have experience, optimizing, doing performance or optimization work on a Go profiler. I'm gonna talk to you about how to manage potential memory leaks and with Go routines and blah blah blah. Like because this is what I do. Like I've spent this is my sort of bread and butter. I talk about it. I tweak about it. This is my jam. Right. Somebody establishes that, I'm all for it. But if you're a brand new speaker touching on a topic that you are not known for, right? But that you really spend a ton of time getting to know and study, and maybe something that happened to you while you were at work or working on an open source project, and you're like, oh, that's curious, and you dive into it and you come up with a good talk. I'm also interested in that sort of level of expertise, right? It's not like you've been doing it for years, right? And just have sort of time put in, right? But you did put a ton of time into learning very specifically what it is that you're about to talk about, right? So I don't like to discount people that new or not, right? New speakers or not. I don't like to discount people on account that they haven't been in a particular space for a long time. It's all about how much time have you spent preparing for this, right? How familiar are you with this? Because again, you're gonna be way more familiar with whatever it is you're talking about. Have on account I haven't prepared for the talk. Hopefully you prepare for the talk, right? Then I could possibly, I might be aware of some of the things you're about to talk about at a sort of superficial level. But if you spend the time diving deep, right, getting to know sort of the nuance and all the crevices, all the edge cases and stuff like that, and you go on stage and you're trying to teach me something, I'm not gonna hold it against you that you haven't been doing this for years, right? I'm gonna be very attentive because I'm like, oh, here's a new person, or here's a person who's encountered this for the first time. It's new to them. Heck, it's new to me. What can you teach me? What this being fresh in your mind, right? It's fresh in my mind too. What can we learn from each other? What can you teach me about how to approach this, right? It's not always about the experience you have. It's about the experience you have preparing for the particular talk as well.
Yeah, and I think that's like a perfectly valid way to build credibility. Like I didn't mean to imply that like it's just
No, I got
experience
you.
and how long about it has he been doing something. I think it's also very helpful for the audience to context set for themselves a little bit of like, oh, if there's like a mistake in a talk or something that's wrong, something that like as an audience member, you're like, is that right? If it's someone that's like, yes, I've been doing this for 30 years, and I know it's like, oh, maybe my understanding was wrong. Whereas if it's someone that maybe doesn't have enough, maybe it's like, oh, maybe they just made a little bit of a mistake. But I think it's easy to kind of just move on from that if you have the right context. Whereas if you don't have the right context, you might just kind of be like, you said something that's very wrong, and I don't understand what level of credibility you're trying to kind of hold or what level of understanding you have. So I don't know if I can believe other parts of your talk. Because that's also like an important part of like getting people to take stuff away from your talk and take knowledge is making sure that they can kind of that they can push through any smaller mistakes that might have popped up in your talk. Because I think we've all said things that it's like, no, that's not quite right, or you said that thing wrong. So making sure the audience has a way to kind of forgive you for that, I think is helpful. And I think one of the ways you can do that is by building up like, yeah, I really know this topic well, or like, I don't know this topic super well, but I've studied and researched a lot, and I think I have a good grasp on it. Obviously said, not like I said that, because that might, detriment the audience's confidence in you a bit. But finding a way to say that clearly to the audience and clearly convey, it's like, oh, I don't have 30 years of experience, but you should still listen to me because, I did this research and I did all the things. I figured out how all this works. I think that's super important.
I can tell that as an audience, I find this also to get the understanding of like the suspecting person, but it talks. I need this. Why should I trust you on this topic? Not. I don't know exactly why, but I know that talks with introduction and especially the part my connection to this topic, and it can be I worked in it. It can be I'm curious about this, but just explain your connection to the topic and kind of trust enough. I don't know. Maybe it's academia influencing me, but this really helps me accept the talk better. Mistakes or not, but just being convinced kind of by something.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
I totally get that. I think maybe it's just years of experience sort of teaching me to not not everything is always as they seem kind of thing. Like I've really learned to keep my mind open, right? Even with somebody not having the credentials, right? To speak on something. Again, to touch on what I was saying before, like if they did the research, like that matters way more to me than them establishing sort of a lineage of experience and this and that. Because to me, I don't know, maybe it's where I'm coming from, but the I think that sometimes that can be an unnecessary hurdle to people sharing ideas, right? And again, it can be the lack of experience that maybe they share an idea that maybe it's a solved problem and they just don't have enough time and experience to realize it's a solved problem, but it is their experience of something, right? And I think I go into talks expecting, and I think I alluded to this before, I expect to hear stories about what you experience, right? What is your experience of this thing? Even if I happen to know a little bit about it, what is your experience of it, right? And I'm not gonna, even if you happen to say something wrong on
Exit.
stage, right? Yeah, exactly. Where are you coming from, like with this?
Exactly. Yeah.
I don't particularly care if you've been working in it for decades or whatever it is. Like I want to know in this particular moment, while you are trying to convey something to me, how have you come to be in it, to be looking
Exactly.
at it,
Exactly.
and what are you gonna relay back to me, right? So I put way more emphasis on that than I do on sort of what your credentials were coming into it, or even if I'm already familiar with your work from other things, right? Because this could be a brand new topic for you. Like I know you're a great speaker from other things that I've seen on stage or on YouTube or whatever, but on this thing you could be a brand new, concept could be brand new for you. Let's talk about this thing specifically. I don't want you to rest on your laurels past.
For
Yeah, I
sure.
think that
Credentials are really not always important to prove if you should be speaking about this or not, but what got you to this and how what is the effort that you've put into that? Was this like a work project? Was it something you were just hacking on? Were you just reading about this? This is it makes that personal connection, which is a fun, interesting segue from the self introduction to the actual content, but also helps me like accept diving into that to the talk.
Yeah, I feel like that's
And I
like
think sometimes I do that, and then the talk starts with, "Hi, my name, I work at. It's nice to be here." So memory profile, kind of. I also like sometimes
yeah.
segmenting and kind of doing those jumps, but I think here adding that one. So I had this problem at work, and I looked into that, and this is what I found, is doing the talk so much better.
Yeah, I feel like something people might who haven't given talks before might not understand is that like pretty much all talks are, it's all storytelling. Even if you're storytelling about something that's like very like fact based and whatnot, it's like you're still weaving a narrative, and like you need to remember like you need to follow the kind of syntax and structure of the narrative to kind of guide your audience. And I think like building that context is like a very important part of telling that story. So yeah, you need to have that, building, the initial set of, criteria for the world you're in. You need to explain that for a bit, and then you can have like, the rising action and the inciting incident and all of the other parts of storytelling.
The all is lost moment.
Yeah. But I also think that helps too with like the overall structure of your talk, and getting your audience to take away more is by actually following a storytelling arc or a narrative arc. Because it's very important to like especially if if you're not really just telling a story, a nonfiction specifically narrative, like don't foreshadow unless like you really need to foreshadow. Just tell people up front what you're going to tell them. That puts them in the right mindset to learn something of like, hey, I'm going to teach you this, and then you teach them the thing, and then you say, and in review, I've taught you this thing, and so you can like kind of bookend things well. So I think that's like, when I say story, I think some people might be like, oh, well, you gotta have all these like foreshadowing and all this withholding of information. It's like, it's not like a fiction narrative. But I think that like the context setting that you were talking about, Natalie, I think that's a very important part of it. Of like, you got to build the story. You can't just jump into the middle of it, because I'm just going to be confused. Maybe when you're a more like advanced storyteller slash speaker, and you know how to kind of navigate that well, you can try that. But if you're a first time speaker, I would suggest not trying to jump straight into the let's just jump into the middle of the story and hope that I can build the context around it enough that my audience just doesn't walk away confused.
Yeah.
So those are a lot of, I think there's like a lot of good tips, tricks, and not tricks, tips, and are there tricks? I don't know if they practices. Yeah, that sounds better than trick the audience into liking my talk. I'm wondering if they're
you like this talk, quickly switch.
They're like it's just subliminal messaging. You like this talk. I'm wondering if there are some unconventional, maybe even unpopular opinions around sort of the art of giving a talk, the art of acing a talk.
I like not starting with my self-introduction, but diving into the topic. And after a couple of slides, introducing myself, and then kind of, this is a topic you're here to listen about, and then this is my connection to it, and this is my segue, actually my experience with it. And then, so kind of introducing two things: A, the topic; B, myself; and then the connection.
I like that. I've done that as well. Yeah, I like that.
Does this tricks because it's a little bit of sorcery?
It's I don't think it's trick. I think it's when you start out with the top, because I think people are so trained to in sort of the typical way. People are like, oh, hey, this is who I am, this is who I work for, blah blah blah, right? When you don't start off that way, you kind of catch people off guard a little bit, like, oh, okay, that's interesting. Like you usually at this point, the like I remember I've done it once. Like I give an entire talk, and then I realized, and it wasn't on purpose, I realized, oh crap, I didn't actually introduce myself. And at as sort of the very last thing, so I'm like, oh, by the way, I'm Johnny. Exactly, yeah. Like I'm Johnny. I happen to be doing this, right? But it was completely like by accident. And guess what? Nobody cared. Nobody cared. It was like, okay, like they got what they came to get from the talk, and that's the thing. Like most of the time, people just want the knowledge, right? Like, and I'll admit this, I don't remember the names of, not even the first names of all those speakers that go on stage at a conference. Like I can't. Like I'm already in the middle of like a ton of people. I'm meeting and shaking hands with a bunch of people. Some of them I might be aware of online. I might know their Twitter handle or something, but I don't know their real names. And like I keep hearing names all day throughout the day for multiple days at times. Like I can't remember the name of every speaker that goes on stage, right? But I will remember a memorable talk, right? Like a funny talk, or like a very insightful, or even like a hard technically dense talk. I might remember bits and pieces of that stuff, and knowing that I can always go back on YouTube when the things are released and sort of rewatch it, right? I will remember those things. I'm much more likely to remember a talk and its topic than I am to remember a speaker. So a speaker's name or where they work at, or anything of that nature. Like to me, that's less important. If these things are important enough to me, that's because I'm trying to find you, right? I'm like, oh yeah, like didn't that person work at what is it, so and so company or whatever it is? I think their talk was specifically about this, right? Like and then that gives me an idea. I can go on YouTube, find the talk, find the description, whatever it is, and find who it is. Like I'm only looking up a person when I actually need to get in touch with them, or I need to actually point them or point somebody else in their direction. Like, hey, yeah, so-and-so gave a talk at GopherCon on this particular topic, and specifically, you will find that interesting. You will find that useful. Here's a link. Here's a person, whatever it is, right? Find them on Twitter if you have questions or something like that, right? That is the only time I care about, sort of a speaker's bio or name.
Yeah, I think too, at most conferences, I think there's an MC who will introduce the speakers as well. So
Right.
you don't necessarily have to do it in your talk because someone has just done it for you as well.
Exactly. But you'd be surprised. People, show up. Slide one. It's it's about them.
I've done that where it's just like, and it's such an awkward thing too, because you're just like, oh, this person just spent like 30 seconds like talking about me and my bio and everything, and then I'm like, hi, I'm Kris. Yeah, just as this other person has said. And you're like, oh crap. I like the way that you kind of like rearrange things, Natalie, because then it like, the audience like heard what they said, but you get to kind of reinforce it later. So it's like a reinforcing action where it's like, okay, I've gotten introduced by the MC. I'm gonna talk a little bit about my talk, and then, oh right, remember this is who I am, and then continue the rest of your talk. Like I like that structure. It's
I feel you're a little bit kind of convincing people on why should they listen to a talk by you about this. You mention more your job title, whatever, if you're open source contributor or something like this. And talk itself, it's more like, so this is my connection to this specific thing, and it's more like, no, right. I'm a software engineer, but I worked on this project. Introduction, but that leeway.
Yeah.
What other unpop do we have?
Do you write on your Twitter handle? I'm gonna guess yes. So do you write the conference handle or hashtag or say socials from the conference?
Ooh, I've never done that. I put my Twitter handle, but not.
Yeah. Just Twitter handle.
So I'm doing that for the reason that I'm and retweet, and then as also wearing the hat of an organizer, I know that it's a lot easier for me to look who either tag the conference using the hashtag, and then retweet that.
Yeah.
Rather than getting for the Twitter who tagged the current speaker and so on, like that's too much.
Right.
And then as an attendee, I don't remember that. I see it in front of my face. It's easy for me to use that.
Right. Yeah, I think like if the conference can tell you, because I think sometimes too, like the organizers don't tell you what the like Twitter handle they're going to use is, so if you don't know to put in your slides. But if they tell you, then I think like I would probably include them, like, oh yeah, like here's my Twitter handle and like hashtag, whatever conference it is. So I think like, and I think too, it's like fine if organizers like request that you put it on your slides. Like I think that as long as that's not like a demand, as long as it's just like, hey, we would,
sure.
if you're putting info, social media info, here's the, the hashtag to include, or like the account to @ along with your account or whatever. Because I think that would also make it more uniform across all of them for, the people running the social media side of things.
What I definitely don't like is receiving a template from a conference.
Yeah, no, absolutely not.
Oh, I do not like. Oh, you know what's worse than that? Being forced to use a template from the company you work for.
Oh God, no.
Luckily, that never happened.
I cringe. I would rather like not give a talk than to be forced to do that, right? Like I don't mind mentioning who I work for at any given point in time, right? Like we all work for somebody. Even if it's for ourselves at some point, whatever it is, like it's okay to mention who you work for right now or whatever it is, right? But I've even started not including sort of employee information in like bios or things of that nature, because every once in a while I'll see or read something or listen to something and they mention like, oh yeah, Johnny Boursiquot is blah blah at some company that I worked for like 5 years ago. I'm like, oh, that's not accurate. Right. Yeah. So I've begun sort of omitting that stuff from bios and introductions and things, because it doesn't matter. Again, nobody cares. It doesn't matter, right? Unless somebody's looking for you to, unless somebody's looking at where you work as sort of the corroborating evidence that you might know what you need to know, that you might know what you say like your credentials. If you say, hey, I worked at Google, I work for Fang, or whatever, if somebody cares about those kinds of credentials, first of all, that's great for you. I don't put a whole lot of stock into things like that, but if that's what they need and you feel like that's going to give you, the edge, fine, right? Do it. Yeah. But, to me, I I care way more about you, the person, and not you, the all the extra stuff, the embellishment, the plumage that you're trying to show off. I don't care about that stuff. Let's get to the content. Let's get to the meat of things.
I will add two little bits of nuance to that. I think for the conference, like the employer slides, I think if you're giving a talk at an employer conference, then it's okay for them to hand you like here's the slide template that you should use. I'm like, okay, this is clearly a thing for work. You want all of the speakers from the company.
You're working. You're working. Literally, you're working. Yeah.
So I'm like, okay, that's fine. And I think for your credentials, like if you're giving a talk that's like, oh, this is about how we built this thing at company X, like I sure hope you worked at company X. So I'd like to know that you did in fact work at company X. So I think for those types of talks, it is kind of important to put like, yes, I did in fact work at this place, or I concurrently work at this place, right? But yeah, in general, I'm just like, no. I want to use my own slides, use my own whatever. Especially since I think my slides, I tend to they're just something for the audience to look at most of the time. Like I do not like when people just put things on their slide that they're gonna say. Like unless it's like, you should reserve that for the things you really want to like bury into the minds of your audience with that reinforcement, and that only works if like it's only a selection of the things you say that you just want to really hammer home. Because if it's literally everything you say is just being read off slides, and the slide, it's going to be, they're not going to hear because they're going to be trying to read while listen at the same time, and those are not going to be in sync, so that's not going to be great. So I think that's something as a first-time speaker I was super nervous about, was just like, my slides, like I don't even know if these make sense. And it's just like, that's okay. Like your slides don't gotta make sense. They should, be loosely related, but you could just, put some nice imagery up there for people to look at while they hear what you say.
Way better.
Yeah.
Like, a few words, a sentence at best. Like I love to see slides like that, right? When it's just focused on imagery. Heck, I'll take a meme over a wall of text any day, right? It's like the imagery, if you can pull it off. Ashley McNamara does an incredible job in her talks, because she's an artist, so she hand draws her stuff and makes it, incorporates it as part of her presentations. But if you're not, if you don't get that kind of, you don't have that kind of skill, but you want to use imagery, try to find some open source, freely available stuff. I don't know, the cool kids these days are using, like maybe some GPT train something to produce images. I don't know. But things of that nature, like because you're there to convey content, not through a wall of text, right? But through a handful of maybe some bullet points, a sentence here and there, lots of imagery, please. And that's it. Like you are going to be speaking, right? You don't want me to be trying to listen to you while you're explaining something, and for me to be trying to read what you got up there on the slides. To me, I can only do one of those things well, and I'd rather be listening to you rather than be reading on your slides.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the AI, and that's kind of my replacement for unpopular opinion for this episode.
Let's get into it.
Instead of asking what is your unpopular opinion, I would ask, would you / have you use AI for your... So let me just make the sound of an unpopular opinion, because that's the closest thing.
Unpopular opinion. I actually think you should probably leave. Unpopular opinion.
So you're AI. Kris, would you / have you used AI for your talks?
No comment.
I'm gonna go with no. I don't know. I feel like I'd put in more effort trying to like craft the right prompt to get it to spit out something that is like, the slides that I want, than it would be for me to just put the slides together. And if I want it to be something that's like really in depth, I think I'd rather just do that research myself and figure out and just think of how I want the talk to flow, rather than trying to get an AI to do it for me. Yeah, I also tend to be a pretty imaginative person, right? Like I'm a writer at heart, so it's like this is the type of stuff I like to do. So I could see where someone who isn't that might want to lean on something that's just like, let's go use the AI. So I think at the end of the day, like, if you make your own slides from your own mind, like, yeah, there's going to be a lot of like stuff that you've seen incorporated. But I feel like I still see AI as just giant statistical models. So it's just kind of like, yeah, it's just going to be like, I don't know, what do popular slides look like? And that's what your slides are going to wind up looking like.
Tony, how about you?
I have not. What I will say is that I'm perfectly okay doing a ton of research using these tools, and I may ask it to sort of distill a very complicated topic or sentence or explanation into some a succinct version, something that is sort of understandable by a middle schooler or something, right? This just so I can see how it conveys, how it simplifies complex ideas, right? Again, I'm trying to learn from it, because it has so much experience, right? Much more experience than I could possibly acquire in a lifetime. So surely there's a simpler way to explain this very difficult concept or topic that I'm trying to convey to my audience. Why don't I let the computer take a crack at it? And 9 times out of 10, it doesn't spit it back out the way I want to convey it back to my audience. So I take it and I make it mine, right? Because oftentimes, again, I'm not on stage to regurgitate facts. I'm on stage to tell a story. I'm on stage to tell my story, my experience of a particular thing. So I'll see what it gives me and say, oh, okay, that's one way to look at it. That's great. Now I incorporate that into my own storytelling, right? That is one thing that, even though you have those GPT models able to sort of generate stories for you and generate imagery and all these things, and that's all well and good, I think there's a certain aspect, even if these things end up getting so good that their output is indistinguishable from some of the best writers or best creative minds in the world, which I'm sure they will if they haven't already, given enough money and compute power and data. At the end of the day, I want to feel like I'm the one who produced this work, right? There's a human aspect of this I want to retain, no matter how good I get at using prompt engineering, and which, by the way, I use quite heavily in my day-to-day work now. It's almost like replace the googling around, Google driven development. That's not a thing for me anymore. Like I literally basically have a ChatGPT tab open, like pinned as part of my workflow. And whenever I have any questions that I would normally go to Google for about coding or examples or whatever it is, I just ask it, and it does a good enough job. That's not my go-to tool, right? So I
for this purpose, the tool that's called Find with a PH.
I came across that, and I've started playing around with it like literally this week. I'm like, oh, this is kind of good. I have to do less, prompt engineering. It's kind of, it's already primed for the kind of things I want to look for. Yeah, indeed. But yeah, that's where I'm coming from with the whole AI thing. Again, regardless of what it is, right? Whether it's for, I will lean on it for very specific, technical bits of knowledge and things, and do fact check it when it spits out things, because it's wrong a few times. But beyond that, use it as a starting point for anything and everything, honestly. Use that as a starting point, see what it says, do some fact checking, and then even if it's correct, take that, make it your own, because I can't see myself sort of completely copy and pasting and see, let's go. That's I don't know, maybe we all will get there at some point, because this is the age of AI and whatnot, if you listen to everybody out there. But there's something about it that I still want to feel like I'm creating something out of my own being. I'm creating something, producing something out of my own mind.
It's like in the Eurovision, you have to use your own voice. With all the
we can't auto-tune it. We can't.
No, in the Eurovision you cannot. It's very little audio magic. You still have to use your own song, your own voice, your own. If you want to do this echo effect, you have to echo effect your.
Nice.
What about you, Natalie? Would you use AI to generate your slides?
I have used, and I am using, and I will be using. Probably one of the first times I used it was last year when I was teaching introductory course on DevOps. So it was very basic. It was for university students in their second year, and this was kind of this is my testing. This is why you need it, and so on. So I asked for it to give me the bullet points, kind of give me on this topic the most important, and then it just gave me like monitoring, testing, and then it's kind of just instead of me having to think about this, which if I would not have AI, what I would do is probably Google the 10 basic concepts and then take like 10 lists, 10 results, I find the most important. So from those 5, it kind of just did that for me, and I take the 3 that I find most important, going back to that rule of 3. So it gives me a good draft to start with, especially for this. Like text-heavy slides, and other places I would use it for when I try to kind of look at a slide and think what I want to say there, because some slides I want to have not a script but 1 or 2 and I know that if I will ask AI for help, it will sound more polished than if I would say that, and I know that even if I memorize it, I will, because I forget how to pronounce something or something like this. So this is English not being my first language comes in. I find it a useful tool kind of to help me sound a balance between more like less simple but also still my voice. And yeah, the 2 main use cases that I have AI for, obviously for generating images and so on. But I do find that basic, if it's like an introductory level something, it's easier to use AI, but because sometimes I like going and speaking about specific niches and so on, it do my work right now. Even the browsing model.
Yeah, I feel like, maybe this is an unpopular opinion in itself, but like part of the reason I dislike a lot of the hype that exists around AI and all of this is because I feel like it's being kind of presented as like this will eliminate the need for all of your other tools that you use, or this will replace people or something like that. And it feels like this is another tool, and a useful tool. But like any tool, you have to understand how to use it well and where it's appropriate to use. And like, just because it's a tool for somebody else doesn't mean it's a tool for you. Like, I've kind of been wondering myself, like, why don't I like AI that much? And I realized that like I love going down rabbit holes and doing like deep research on things and kind of like spelunking around. Like, part of the fun of it is in that kind of going around weird parts of the internet and acquiring information and all of that and going on these adventures. And like, you can't do that as easily with AI. It's like, it's kind of like you just get the shortcut. It's like, oh, I'd like to know this. Okay, here's the answer. So I think like for me, that's why I enjoy doing research in the way that I've kind of always done. I kind of lean more toward that. But that also doesn't mean that we shouldn't have AI tools. I think it's just like, it's just okay if you don't want to use the AI, and know the AI will not be replacing you tomorrow, or perhaps ever. But it's still a useful thing to have in general. But it's not.
My unpop then is to counter what you say and and to say that there is so if we take a step back, right, and this feels oddly familiar to a conversation that actually 3 of us might have had on a podcast before a while back. If we think about how we engineers see tools, right, by some definition of tool, and how businesses and the rest of the world sees tool, right? We have a very narrow view, right, compared to the rest of the world. The rest of the world is thinking, okay, I'm a CEO at a Fortune 5 company, and you telling me, right, that AI can help me cut my engineering staff by right now 25%, maybe in 5 years 75%, right? I want that technology, right? Because what I've wanted all along is not to have engineers. What I've wanted all along is to make money, is to sell a product or service, whatever it is. If I can do that, reduce my costs, and do that with fewer people because there's better tooling, right? That's what I want 9 times out of 10. I'm not in the business of, employing engineers. I'm in the business of making money, right? So we, right, as the engineers have to always keep an eye on what the long term, what the horizon looks like, right? And again, I think we're better than most at sort of anticipating trends because by virtue of being technologists, we see technology come and go all the time, and we know how to sort of keep our ears into the ground, see what the new trends are, what the new languages and new frameworks or whatever it is, and just stay ahead of the game a little bit. That way we can remain employable and sought after and all that stuff. But for the first time, I think this is where this tool is unlike any other that I've seen in my 25 years in this industry, whereby this one literally, for the longest time, businesses have been trying to replace us, right? Because we are the most expensive part of the operation, right? For the longest time, business have been trying to replace us, and now, right, this seems like a viable option. It seems like a viable tool. All the tools that have come up to this point have been tools for us, by us. These tools for the businesses, they're literally saying, oh, this has me thinking, right? I can literally hire fewer of you, say, oh yeah, definitely use your tool. Here's your chat GPT, here's your Find, here's your whatever tool you want. I just need half of you now. I just need half of the staff now, right? A third of the staff now, right? And I don't think we've seen the extent at which and I've seen blog posts and things about, how AI is going to change, industry, not just our own, but lots of industries and things of that nature. I think if we're not careful, we're going to find ourselves, like those farmers who fought the industrial revolution with new machinery coming into the fore and not adopting these things and be like, we're going to do it the old fashioned way, right? I think we're a little in a different position. We're embracing those tools, but make no mistake, right? As soon as the tools can replace us, businesses and corporations are going to get those things instead of hiring people. So what do we do about that? I don't know. I don't have the answer, but it is something that I'm certainly thinking about. And I know Kris has a different opinion.
I mean, I was just kind of thinking in my mind about I feel like that's I see that view from like a VP, SVP of engineering, maybe CTO, but not from a business owner, right? I think the problem is I don't think business owners think rationally even about money. Like a prime example of this, right, is why is there this huge rush to do return to office, right? Like why are companies not just offloading all of their office space? It's expensive. The past few years have proven that they can be extremely profitable, make more money than they were before by not having these offices. It makes their employees wind up working more hours, ironically. Like it hits all of those things that are like, money, ching, 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 ching. Like I can make all of my things look good. And yet they're still like, no, you must come back to the office. We have to have it this way. We have to do things the way we were before. And I think there's a lot of nuance and there's a lot of stuff that goes into that. But I think it's like the same sort of thing with this, where there is this argument of, well, we can just replace all the people with this AI. But I also think like, isn't that just outsourcing again? Haven't we done this before? Haven't we said, we'll just go replace all these expensive Americans with some other people someplace else, and you forget, like, yeah, you can do that and it'll be cheaper, but there's a whole bunch of other logistics around that you need to now handle and deal with. And do you have the ability to actually implement those logistics well?
I just need fewer of you to do it. That's all it is. I just need fewer of you to do it.
Yeah. I do think that there will be I guess in theory there should be an overall reduction in the number of people that we have, but also the other thing that we all know, how many people work at companies where there is a rather annoyingly large chunk of people who don't do anything. And we all know that they don't do anything. And it's very well documented they don't do anything, and yet they're still there, right? It's like, so like I very much understand and to some degree agree with your view on this, Johnny, of like, yeah, no, like there will be some amount of reduction of engineers as a result of these AI tools. how much and when, because also legal departments do not like this generative AI stuff. They do not want you to be anywhere near it. Like there are companies that are just like, you are not allowed to use Copilot. If I find you using Copilot, you will be fired. Just because of all of the legal ramifications of like, can we actually say where this came from? Because if we can't, and it happens to infringe on somebody's copyright or trademark, ouch! Like that's going to cost us. So I think, and we're gonna work through all of this stuff over time for sure. And I do think that the end result will likely be we have fewer software engineers. But I think that over time anyway, that likely is going to be the result. No matter, it's not AI is special. Like we have many fewer software engineers doing like assembly programming than we did, 70 years ago. We have no software engineers that are doing it by hand weaving, like we did to, for all the computers for the moon mission and for all of that other stuff, right? So I think we will have an overall reduction in engineers, but I don't know if it's something that we need to worry about as a people. It's just like, it's change, right? Change is always happening. Change will always come. And that's kind of what I dislike the idea, like not what you're saying, Johnny, but what the other people are saying, where it's just like, there will be no more software engineers, or there will be like a 10th of the software engineers. And it's just like, that feels impractical in the short term. It feels a lot like there will be no more humans driving. We'll have all self-driving cars, or there will be no more, the trucking industry will disappear because, we'll have self-driving trucks. It's like, oh, okay, you've been saying that for about 14 years now. So where are my self-driving trucks? Not to say that I think trucking is a good illustrative example of that, because like trucking as an industry has issues that could, maybe it'd be better if people weren't driving trucks. Maybe it'd be better if that wasn't an industry. But I don't think the answer to that is like, I don't think the self-driving truck thing is going to be the way that we solve that. And I think the same is true for software engineering, where I don't think that our end result is going to be this like, we're all prompt engineers now. I don't think that's gonna. I think there'll be plenty of people. I think there'll be plenty of companies where yes, that's the thing. But I think there will still be plenty of us doing what we do today in the future.
Natalie, thoughts?
This is like AI is another fancy abstraction layer on what we do, and we will not be doing it now, but we will be those who want to keep doing tech will be still sought after. They will just be skills. And also like giving the example of assembly and punch cards and so on. And I do think that this is, like to me, that makes a lot of sense with an abstraction layer of you just need to operate this tech differently.
Yeah. Although I think assembly, not so much punch cards, but definitely assembly is a cautionary tale for us in a way, where it's sort of like a lot of software engineers don't know how computers work. And I think that's becoming a problem. I think it's been a problem. I think it's becoming more of a problem. So it'd be nice if in this next move to this next abstraction, we find a way to make sure that we still have a large enough group of people who understand how things work. Because I think, it's the same problem with open source.
Computers. Yeah, we still need
because I think
computers doing stronger things.
It's the same thing with like open source, right? Where it's like a large amount of open source, like a lot of crucial things are maintained by one human or like 2 or 3 humans, like very, very small numbers of humans. And I think like it's the same thing with like, firmware and all these other things, where it's just like, we have no idea how these things work, and we just hope and pray that like the people that understand how these things work will still be around to make sure that they still function. So I hope in the next this transition that we're about to have, that we make an attempt to not make that same mistake. I'm not hopeful that we'll do that, but
this year, I didn't see too many talks about the topic of AI. So I think maybe this year we're kind of call for papers like for Go Lab in Italy and the Brazil GopherCon and the Ireland GopherCon. I think these are the ones that we'll get to see some talks about AI, but I know that in the European, in the UK, and in the assuming all announced US GopherCons, I didn't see too much about that. So I guess we're all still processing it, but I'm definitely sure that next year we'll have, but it will be more AI heavy. And I hope you will join as well then. So thanks everyone.